This is Gestoras. El episodio de hoy es en inglés. Today's episode is in English. Pueden leer una transcripción en español en nuestro sitio web o pueden ver el episodio en YouTube con subtítulos en español. Gestoras Podcast brings you conversations with cultural managers from the North and the South. We celebrate the work of Latina cultural managers, sharing their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned. The episodes alternate between Spanish and English each week.
Karla Estela Rivera is the Executive Director of the Arts Administrators of Color Network. She is a writer, performer, activist, and arts advocate, fighting to uplift and create opportunities for, with, and in divested communities. Karla made national history as the co-chair of the Illinois Fine Arts Indicator Work Group, which developed the nation's first K-12 indicator in the arts, and is the author narrator of the first ever commissioned Young Audiences piece for the Joffrey Ballet. She is a co-host of the Creative Generation's Why Change podcast.
So hi, Karla. It's so good to see you.
So good to see you. Thank you for having me today.
It's such a thrill to have you. I'm such a fan of you and your work and how you move through life. So I'm very excited to have more people get to know about you and about your work. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
Where are you speaking to us from?
So I am tuning in from my home office in the unceded lands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples, also known as Chicago, Illinois.
Where I want to start is the point of origin. So you are now the executive director of the Arts Administrators of Color Network, this major network that is empowering so many people in the arts. But where did you start out from? Like, where did the fire to start to fix the world come from?
Oh my goodness. So I was born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, and came to Chicago at a young age after my parents' divorce. I was raised by a single mom here in Chicago who also was and is currently a social worker who put herself through school up until nearly my mid-20s. So BA, master's, and PhD in social work. So my mother was the first Latina woman, cis woman, to graduate with a PhD from the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Chicago.
Wow.
And so my biological father was not really a part of my life. But I was raised by my mother and her brother, my uncle, who came up. He was an Afro-Boricua man, Samuel Betances, and he was a high school dropout who later, through mentorship and through caring folks in his life, ended up graduating with his master's and his PhD from Harvard in education. And so, he has historically been involved in a lot of movement work, and particularly around and influenced by the civil rights movement here in the United States. And my mother, had and has just a really strong compass of ethics of, what is kind of right and wrong, and really, for better or worse, never held her tongue about those things, right? And so to that end, I was always raised with social justice issues around me and with a mind for social justice. I would also say, as an artist, my grandmother, Carmen Luisa Justiniano, a woman who was a Jíbara, and and Jibara, for folks who don't know, is Puerto Rican for campesina, country person. And
Hmm.
so was raised in Las Maria and Maricao in Puerto Rico in the mountains, um, and was a writer. And her autobiography is the only one that we know of that exists that is a firsthand account of Puerto Ricans of that generation, kind of after receiving, after being, after the annexation and after, becoming a colony of the United States. And so I grew up largely with my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, and had always seen my grandmother writing on legal pads, just consistently had an artistic practice, did not necessarily belong to an artistic community. Um, that just wasn't part of her lot and in life, but was always had an artistic practice, was a self-published poet, to the point that when things changed, she published her own book of poetry, and then when certain things changed, she would just white it out in the book. And so artistically, my root, I'm rooted there. And when my grandmother passed in 92, um, my grandmother passed in 92. Shortly thereafter, I wrote my first play. And it really was a way for me to process that loss, because we were very, very close. And so from there, I like to tell folks I really am the product of municipal and philanthropic investments in the arts, particularly for, working class, low income kids in the city of Chicago. So I became part of this program called Gallery 37, which is now After School Matters. And from there, really, kind of grew with that work. I was inspired in a lot of ways, not only because I had these words and these stories living in me, but also because there was such a lack of representation. And so, there weren't a ton of nuanced and deep and thoughtful characters out in the world when we think about theater and film and television in the 80s and the 90s.
Hmm.
And even today, we still aren't seeing, we're seeing more of it. And there's some beautiful movements out there and some beautiful work being done. Um, but really, the market is cornered, particularly in the mainstream, by very few people. And so I was really dissatisfied by that. And I was like, well, I'm gonna write the characters I want to see in the world, and that's what I'm gonna do. And went to film school at Columbia College, um, and did some studies at New York University. But I lived kind of a double life because the arts economy is not one that is robust, if you will. And so
It's a very gentle way of putting it.
my mother is so funny because my mother really wanted me to grow up cultured. And
Yeah, yeah, and I wanted to ask you what led you to theater in the first place. So, and then to film. Why that art form and not something else?
yeah, for me, initially when I wrote my first play, it was just, it was the playwriting program, and I always knew I was a writer. And I would say also as a teen, I did teen. I was the bureau chief of New Expression, which was a citywide magazine that was by and for high school students. And so I was really hungry to just put stories out there in any way, shape, or form. And so that to me was the driving force for a lot of the work. My power is in my words. I'm not a great actor. I'm not, but I can write a mean story. So and that I just knew from a very, very early age.
Yeah. And I'm interested in the concept that you were raising a little earlier of making space and finding space, because you pointed out, right, that we live rather precarious lives in the arts or uncertain
Mhm.
lives. Were you aware of that as you were coming through, as you were growing up?
Oh, I was always aware of it, in large part because you know, I knew from, the moment I told my mom took me to see Fiddler on the Roof. Topol, if folks understand who Topol is, like, he was synonymous with that particular play. And so my mother took me to that play, and my mother had this tradition of taking me to Broadway caliber shows. Um, because for her, participating in those activities was a gateway to the middle class. And so uh, it kind of backfired on her, because the moment I saw this show and the moment I saw all of this love for Topol and this incredible piece, I said, "Mommy, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life." It's like, "You're going to be a waitress for the rest of your life." So, so although I thought it was an insult, and I took it as an insult. I took it as an attack on my own talent. But the
Mm,
reality is, no matter how talented you are, there were not enough outlets. And the outlets that existed, there was an expectation of doing a significant amount of work for free.
right.
And that life, either at a very reduced rate or free, is not sustainable. And, when I became a parent, that's when I was like, "Oh, I can't really sleep on people's couches anymore now." And I moved into this kind of double life of working in the nonprofit sector, in community-based organizations, while also being part of local theater companies. And here in Chicago's a theater town.
Oh, yeah.
And not only with kind of what I call the cultural bigs. So people will instantly, when they think about theater in Chicago, think about Steppenwolf or the Goodman.
Yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
for me, it was places like Urban Theater Company, which was on Division Street, which is in the Puerto Rican community, the heart of the Puerto Rican community here in Chicago,
Mm,
and other organizations. And none of us were making any money. I mean, it is only now that these organizations are starting to really get get on their legs financially in significant ways. So I was always kind of in this place where I was juggling two different universes, or trying to find a way to mix them. So I was running youth programming, and I was like, "Oh, we're going to role play." And so I always tried to infuse. And, to the credit of the arts, you can really put them anywhere. 'Cause- And all movements, and all initiatives are really carried through the vessel of art, if you think about it.
in this double life that you were leading, did you find people were receptive? Some people were skeptical.
Um, it was a mixed bag. It was a real mixed bag. And in some instances, people saw the effectiveness of my strategies, particularly when I was doing youth development work. But as I kind of moved up within organizations and got director level work, or was in fundraising, and other areas, you know, my significance within these spaces was diminished because I was the artist. And so in some circles, there is this perception that artists lack a certain sense of business, or a certain formality,
Yeah.
that and that we are more sensitive, or whatever kinds of uh, tropes you can think about when it comes to artists in non-artistic situations. Those labels were put on me. And I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with being extra sensitive and in tune with people when you're thinking about community work. But it's certainly, I found myself in a lot of political situations. I found myself in a lot of um, kind of cutthroat situations, which
Mm,
is, there's certainly some of that in our sector and in our work, but this was really different. And so I
mm,
had to, I accepted those as learning moments. So I learned how to run a communications department. I learned about policy. I took, moms who are largely immigrant Spanish speaking mothers and drove down um, to the state capitol. And I said, this is your house. Right. And that is largely driven by the values that were instilled in me at a very young age. So by osmosis, I got a lot of this. And so I was able to parlay that into the work that I was doing. And so, yeah.
and for some of the, particularly the women, the younger women who may be hearing you, right, as you're talking about these really challenging um, spaces that you were in, right? Not only as an artist, but as a young woman, as a Latina. What is or was your approach to dealing with rejection, to dealing with opposition? How do you find this? How did you find the strength to just figure out ways to engage with that and move forward?
Depending on where I was, I had to learn that those spaces that I was in were not artistic spaces, which are largely a lot more collaborative and a lot more trusting. And, um, and by nature, um, there was a level of respect there. Um, and so, I had to learn that in some instances, I had to do a thing and apologize later.
I really like that strategy. I'm a firm believer in
I
you
was
can
like,
always apologize.
this is the thing that I know will work. And guess what? If it backfires, then me hago la loca, oh, really? Oh, okay.
Well, because many times, not always, but sometimes asking for permission is enabling gatekeeping.
Facts. And there was a lot of times where I was told I was not ready. There were a lot of times, and also by not only, cis white males or in majority white spaces, but also in Latino spaces that were largely cis male occupied. And so, and that hurt even more than the cis white men, because that I kind of expected from them. But in these other spaces where we were supposed to be community, and you were supposed to, and we had a shared history and a shared experience, um, I quickly learned, and I think this is part of the scarcity mindset as well, that colonialism and a colonial mindset will teach you, is that I have to be the one, I have to be the hero, it's going to be me. And then there's also personalismo, right?
Yeah.
And that is very endemic in the Latina community, where it's,
Hmm.
this is the person that is the face of the movement, and what they say goes. And so I never liked that. And I'm always uncomfortable with the word no. And I think, when I've been told that I'm not ready, maybe in those instances I might not have been. But how else are leaders supposed to learn, grow, if they're not just, put out into the world and make some mistakes? And so, yeah, you got to get there somehow. And I didn't want anything handed to me either.
Did you have people, either mentors or someone who was exactly at the right place, right time for you, who helped you,
Yeah.
who maybe stepped aside and gave you a space? And what things, what kind of attitudes or movements that they made for you were particularly helpful?
Yeah, a couple. So, I really have to give a lot of credit to one of my early bosses, back in 2011, 2012. Diana Mendoza, she was the director of the youth development department at an organization called Instituto del Progreso Latino, and really gave me a chance to run a youth community outreach program on the south side of Chicago. And largely, and at that point my resume was really it was art and restaurants. Right? That was my background. It was teaching artistry and the restaurant world, because I did put 10 years into that industry through college and things like that. And so I gave a couple of scenarios on how I would run certain programs, and really that day she hired me. And that was also, it was in that place where I learned that I became, that I was pregnant. And she was like, you have choices, right? And and so just in every step of the way, I really felt like she understood me in a way that other supervisors may not have, and was always looking out for me. The job that I took was part-time. After I had my daughter, she advocated for this work to be full-time so that I could have benefits and things like that. And I would absolutely say that she took a chance on me and really allowed me um to just do the thing.
Yeah.
And I really credit her for getting me started in the working world. And she was a great help very, very early on. And I would say the other person, there were quite a few other people a few years ago when I was having some challenges within my own workplace, um, that I could lean on, and just they knew instinctively what my challenges were. But I was in an organization where I realized I was making $100,000 less than my white
Mm.
male counterpart, and had some really significant challenges at that organization. And really went to these women, black women, Latina women, and a couple of white women, and they were just like, oh, we need to move you out of this space. What do we need to do? And
Mm.
and they did.
It's always beautiful when people use their power and their positions, not just to create those spaces, but to see the people who could be in those spaces, right? Like this woman saw you. She saw you, right, and your potential and what you could bring. And I think the other important part of what your story is, that she was willing to give up control, that she was willing to create the space and just give up control and see how it happened, but at the same time providing support. Like, that's a really delicate balance there, but it has to have those three things, right? Create the space, give the control, provide the supports, and sort of think ahead to what this person is going to need. So now you are the executive director of the Arts Administrators of Color Network. What is it? What is your role in it? What are your priorities?
Yeah. So the Arts Administrators of Color Network is a nonprofit organization that is national in scope. It was started by two incredible Black women, African American women, in Washington, D.C., Quanice Floyd and Ariel Davis. Um, and the short version of that story is that they quite often found themselves in spaces within the sector where decisions were being made about communities, particularly communities of color. Um, and, it was the seminar, it was the workshop, it was the decision making room, it was all of those spaces. And so they often found themselves being the only people of color in the space. And so they said to themselves, one, this can't be right. And two, there's got to be more to this. And, we are abundant as a network. And we also have to know that there are challenges that exist for people of the global majority. And how do we create an environment where people can take off their armor and feel held, feel seen and held, and share resources, share stories, whether they be stories of triumph or stories of challenge. And how do we grow that? So it became happy hours, and happy hours became dinners, and dinners became meetings, and then meetings became what in 2016 was the Arts Administrators of Color Network. And so our work is really about championing artists of the global majority across the United States, whether they be in predominantly white institutions or whether they are in an entrepreneurial space where they are running their own institutions. It is about building that network, providing programming and opportunities for their own professional growth. And it is also an advocacy organization. So, I always say, like, we get to be the agitators in spaces where folks may not feel like they can agitate because their livelihood is on the line.
Right.
And so we recently underwent a strategic planning process. And, after a transformative gift from Mackenzie Scott, that begat kind of my hiring, the hiring of me in this space. And we have three real mandates for the organization. One is to build the infrastructure of the organization. So right now it's just me as the paid staff member. So I'm excited that, soon we'll be bringing on a development director to help with fundraising and other positions. We're growing our board. The other is to continue to grow the network. So we have 12 affinity spaces, both cultural thread and work thread. We have an annual convening that will be held here in Chicago in November. And then the other is to build a by us, for us legislative and advocacy platform. And so that is work that we are beginning to undergo this year.
Thank you for sharing all of that. It's a fantastic organization. I've known Quinice for many years, and she is just a force of nature, and Ariel as well. And the field has such an enormous debt to both of them. Do that. I want to ask you, because you were running a theater in Chicago,
Yeah.
right? You were running the Free Street Theater. And what made you decide that you wanted to do this, that you wanted to move away from running a theater and move towards running an organization like Arts Administrators of Color?
Even though I am by trade a writer, we still have a long way to go to create the environment that would allow me to just be a writer. And it would be a disservice to myself and to whoever comes after me to not take this dissatisfaction I feel, about where we're at from a racial justice perspective, from a gender perspective, to not utilize the gifts that I have acquired over the last few years, even though I've had kind of an unorthodox pathway to where I am. It's funny because when people ask what you do, I really consider myself a multi hyphenate. And so, to that end, and people are like, what's that? This is our future, friends. Is that I don't think this job didn't exist when I was a child so that I could dream about it. And I don't think that, when my child comes of age, that the job that they imagine that they will acquire, the jobs that they will have will, currently exist. Um, but I learned about and have been involved in advocacy. Right, I made national history as the co-chair of the Illinois Fine Arts Indicator Work Group. So in the United States, Illinois is the first state in the nation to have a meaningful measure for accountability in the arts in K-12 education. And I was the co-chair of that statewide work group. Um, my history in understanding inequity, in this country, all of those things, organizing, fundraising. I mean, I really picked up these skills over the years.
Mhm.
And and initially, when I led Free Street, um I really thought that I would be there for a really long time. I became an ED for the first time in October of 2019, and then
Perfect
perfect
timing.
timing, right? And so I had to learn real quick, what the hierarchy needs were for the organization. And really for the first 2 weeks, we really didn't do anything but check in on ourselves and deal with our humanity. And then we were like, okay, how do we pivot the work, etc. And so I learned very quickly how to lead in these ways. And I'll always be an artist. Uh,
I want to ask you about your artistic practice, right? Because you were in Second Story in Chicago, and now you have something very exciting coming up with Joffrey. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah. So yeah, I'm still a company member at Second Story. So I do that. That's the only place where I really have performed over the last decade. And then the Joffrey. And it's interesting because it was because of a conference that I attended, a statewide conference that I attended in my day job, if you will, that got me this particular gig, which is I was contracted to write the first ever commissioned young audiences ballet for the Joffrey Ballet.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
And I'm 45 years old now. I saw my first ballet ever uh 2 years ago. Erica Edwards, at the time, she was the director of community engagement for the Joffrey. We met at One State Together in the Arts conference in Galesburg, Illinois, uh, and had some fun adventures in this town that has some very interesting. They don't have Uber, we learned very quickly. And but got to know each other over the course of a couple of days. And on the train ride home, she says, hey, would you be interested in becoming in engaging in this project? And I said, yeah, but I've never been to the ballet before. I have no zero, like the dance background I have is what has happened in my house and in my kitchen. That is the extent of my dance experience. She said, but you're a storyteller, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And so you know in our industry, I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh, we should work on a project together. And 9 times out of 10, that becomes the thread of conversation every time we see each other. But she was for real. And it got so real that I was on a call. It was myself, Elisa Chavarri, who is an illustrator, beautiful illustrator, and Amy Hall Garner, who is a wonderful choreographer. And we were on the call with Erica and the head of the Joffrey Academy and the entire marketing team and the entire develop. And I was like, oh, and these artist respected agents. And I said, oh, this is real. Oh, this is, yeah. I need an agent, don't I? and and we pitched the story called Rita Finds Home to the Joffrey Ballet, and they loved it. And the story is, I dug real deep here, which is about a young island girl who dreams about being in the big city. And in the beginning, the mom is like, well, this is where you are, this is where you're from, and appreciate your surroundings. But they become displaced by a hurricane, and it is on they move to a big city, and it is
I'm
through
not
their
seeing any parallels with anything here.
not at all whatsoever, right? So Rita, through her own experience and through generous friends, finds her people and redefines what it means to be home in a different land. And I was inspired in part, sure, by my own journey, but also it was a love letter to the survivors of Hurricane Maria, many of whom were displaced from the island in 2017. And it was a co-production between the Joffrey and the Miami City Ballet, and and it showed to over 4,000 families in Miami. It premiered in July. Was it July? In July of last year here at Navy Pier. And so it was recently at Aurora University. And I am imagining that it has some legs further down the line. But it was an unlikely union. But I have found a really interesting artistic home at Joffrey, and they've been really, really lovely. And um,
Do you think it would come to DC at some point?
perhaps folks can reach out to the Joffrey Ballet and but yeah, and so I continue to write, and I continue to do a lot of work with Second Story and my own artistic work, and I continue to write plays and screenplays. I'm not as active as I would like to be. Again, I need to work myself out of a job first. I think there will be a point where I find peace with what I've been able to do. And, and I think this is what is often endemic in our sector, is that people really want to hold on to particular roles because this is all they know. But, I can't, I say I'm a tia in training. I'm a doña in training, and I am ready to live my best life in a bata, and, it won't be legal pads, but it'll be, an iPad or something, and I will continue to create work.
Yeah, because I can't imagine you not writing. Till the last minute, you'll be holding a pen or a stylus or something. I
Something.
cannot imagine you. Well, you were saying earlier, how 9 times out of 10, when we say we have to work together on something, it doesn't happen. I've been saying a version of that to you for a bit, and I'm so glad that at least in this format we got to do something together.
Yeah.
We're almost at the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, I think we talked about this, that we are asking each guest who comes on our podcast to leave a question for the person who comes next, or to put a question in the question bank for another one of our guests, and then to also answer the question of one of the questions in our bank. So are you ready for this? All right. So the question comes from Ninoska Medel, who is the founder of the Women's Orchestra in Chile. And she asks, how can we occupy our situation as women who are privileged to democratize access to the arts? And she was referring to women who are privileged in the sense of women who have obtained a position of power, who have reached a position where they can have some authority or recognized authority. So how do you use that situation to democratize access to art?
That's that's always been my mission, I think, since I was a child. And and of course, in the seat that I'm in now as the executive director of Arts Administrators of Color, my goal and the goal of the organization is to, have us occupy spaces where we traditionally have not been, and not just in the craft, in the making, because there's no shortage of artists of color, but there is a shortage of arts leaders in spaces making the decisions that move the needle for us. And so I will uh, from in the seat that I'm in currently, my goal is to leverage that power and the privilege that I have, to be vocal in spaces where I might be the only one in the room,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, this is not going to work. Um, and, one of the conversations that I have been having a lot, particularly with folks who talk a good game about racial equity in, in artistic spaces, is to say, we collectively need to reimagine what this work looks like. And for those of you who are in a particular seat of power and sit in a particular seat, and you've been doing it for a long time, and you also need to reimagine what your role is, and how you are, not throwing your hands and giving up and walking away, unless that's what you want to do. But it is reimagining how you are truly leveraging that to either get in the way of the forces that push against us, or to create space for those of us that need to occupy your seat when you leave it.
Yeah.
How are we really truly intentionally building those systems, and how are we intentionally stepping to the side when we need to, and how are we as women of color, in the space, understanding where we can, what our niche is, and where somebody else might be a better fit.
And that's really hard
100%.
sometimes, because when there's so much scarcity and there's no space, sometimes it's very hard to walk away from those situations. But it's one of the ways that we can make the entire system different and stronger by saying, I'm not the right person, but this is the right person to do.
Yes. I pride myself in being a connector. My first month at AAC, Juanice handed my calendar link to the country. I feel like, and I was in a lot of calls, and I said to them, look, if folks have watched The Matrix, in The Matrix, if you take the red pill or the blue pill, well, Neo is the one that's going to get us out of this. I am not Neo. I am not going to be the one that solves all the problems. We are collectively going to do that. And so I want us all in the room, because I represent but a sliver of the Puerto Rican experience, a sliver of the Latina experience, a sliver of the Chicago Latina experience, and of that generation that is ni de aquí ni de allá, which is because I'm still very connected to the island. But I do find myself in times figuring out where I fit in, and I know that's not unique to me. So
I think it's very, very much a shared experience of Latinas.
yeah.
This being a sliver of the experience, a sliver, I think it's a really beautiful way to express it. It's probably one of the things that most animated me to start this podcast, because I've been in a lot of spaces, and I get to be in a lot of spaces, in a lot of rooms where I am the only one who is Latina. But first of all, I don't always need to be the person who's there. And second of all, when I'm sitting there, I'm thinking of all the people I know, particularly women, I know who would be incredible to have in that group. That's what animated me to start this podcast, because they're mostly, I think, either invisibilized, and we also don't have that connection, right, between North and South.
Yeah.
Of the women who are doing this work. So that's another piece that animated me as well, right? And what you were talking earlier about the importance of community and the importance of connection and network is so fundamental. And also to know that we're not alone, right?
That's right.
All right, so you've answered the question. Now my final question for you is to ask you for your question. What would you like to leave for another one of your gestoras colleagues?
So here's the question. What are the generational expectations that you are holding back or interrupting in order for the generations that come after you to continue to move the needle in progress?
Oh, I love that. All right, it goes into question bank, and we'll bring it up for whoever's next. Thank you. Karla Estela Rivera, the Executive Director of Arts Administrators of Color Network. It's been just a joy to talk to you. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming to Gestoras and sharing all these really, really deep and important thoughts with us, and with so much candor, which is you, basically. So, thank you so much.
Un placer, gracias.
This episode of Gestoras was presented by Jimena Varela and produced by Anush Titanyan. It was recorded in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and mixed at the Arts Management Program at American University, Washington, D.C. The music was by Eli Almic, and the graphic design was by Bea Silva. Find us on YouTube at Gestoras, on Instagram and Facebook at Gestoras Podcast. Thank you for listening.